Pain, I found, is a highly efficient calculator. It strips away the noise, the sentimentality, and the delusions of hope, leaving only raw, undeniable data. Right now, the data was telling me that both of my femurs were splintered into approximately 40 distinct fragments. The impact had severed the femoral arteries, and based on the pooling warmth spreading rapidly beneath my lower back on the freezing stone floor, I had roughly 4 minutes of consciousness left before hypovolemic shock shut down my brain entirely. I didn't scream. Screaming accelerates the heart rate, which pumps blood out of the body faster, reducing my 4-minute timer to perhaps 2. Down here on the abyssal floor of a C-rank dungeon, time was the only currency I had left. A harsh, artificial spotlight cut through the suffocating darkness of the cavern. It poured from a hovering spatial portal 10 feet above me. Standing at the edge of that portal, bathed in the safe synthetic light of the exit, was the Vanguard Guild's elite raid team. At their center stood Ilara, my fiancée. She was adjusting the diamond-studded cufflink on her immaculate, spotless white mage robes. Her pristine appearance was a stark contrast to the dungeon's grim, blood-soaked atmosphere. She didn't look like a woman who just watched her partner's legs get crushed by her vice master's warhammer. She looked like a CEO checking her watch before a board meeting. "You really didn't scream," Ilara noted, her voice drifting down from the portal. It was a smooth, practiced tone, completely devoid of warmth. "I always hated that about you, Kael. Even now, you look at me like I'm a line item on a spreadsheet." "You are," I replied. My voice was a dry, ragged rasp, barely louder than a whisper, but the acoustics of the cavern carried it perfectly. "A depreciating asset. I financed Vanguard. I bought that staff in your hand. I bought the loyalty of the men standing behind you. Mathematically, this betrayal is a net loss for the Guild's long-term PR." A low, mocking chuckle echoed from the man standing to my right. Valen, Vanguard's S-rank tank, and the man holding the warhammer dripping with my blood. "Always the analyst, aren't you, Kael?" Valen sneered, resting the massive weapon on his shoulder. "But your math is flawed. The public doesn't care about the guy who bankrolled the guild. They care about the heroes. And unfortunately for you, a hero needs power. Your awakening trait is slumber. You're the only hunter in global history whose unique skill is literally falling asleep. You're a laughingstock, a PR nightmare, and frankly, a dead weight." Ilara stepped slightly forward, her perfect face completely emotionless. "Vanguard is going public next quarter, Kael. We can't have a talentless sleeper on the executive board. Furthermore, the apex predator of this abyssal floor is a mutated variant. We need it distracted long enough to extract the dungeon core and seal the gate. A living, bleeding human bait is the most efficient method." She didn't show an ounce of guilt. She had calculated the return on investment of my murder, and the numbers made sense. I couldn't even be angry. It was a flawless, ruthless corporate strategy. "Goodbye, Kael," Ilara said, turning her back to me. "Try to keep it busy for at least 5 minutes." The portal snapped shut with a sharp, vacuum-like hiss. The artificial light vanished instantly, plunging me into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eyes. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ragged sound of my own failing lungs and the steady drip, drip, drip of my blood seeping into the porous ancient stone. Then, the cavern began to vibrate. It started as a low, subsonic rumble that rattled the loose teeth in my jaw. The temperature in the room plummeted, the moisture in the air flashed freezing into a thin mist. The apex predator was waking up. From the pitch-black void, 2 massive, glowing crimson orbs ignited. They were eyes, each the size of a transport truck, burning with an ancient, localized hatred. As the beast stepped forward, the ambient mana in the room illuminated its silhouette. It was a titanic, shadowy chimera, part wolf, part draconic nightmare, wreathed in dark purple flames. 50 feet of pure, unadulterated slaughter. It lowered its massive snout, sniffing the air. It smelled the blood. It smelled me. My heartbeat finally began to slow. The cold was creeping up my chest, numbing the agony in my shattered legs. This was the end of the line. The system had deemed me useless. Humanity had deemed me a sunk cost. Now, nature was here to collect the scraps. But as the colossal beast opened its jaws, revealing rows of jagged, sword-length teeth dripping with corrosive saliva, a sharp, crystalline sound pierced my mind. It wasn't the roar of the monster. It was a sound I hadn't heard since the day I first awakened 10 years ago. System ding. Critical biological failure imminent. Host mortality rate calculated at 99.99%. The blue holographic text flared to life in the darkness, hovering inches from my face, illuminating the jagged teeth of the beast descending upon me. System ding. Extreme duress detected. Useless trait slumber is undergoing forced survival evolution. I watched, my blood loss-addled brain perfectly processing the data, as the blue text began to glitch, twisting into a deep, corrupted gold. Evolution complete. Unique trait slumber has evolved into mythic trait Parasitic Idle System. System alert. Apex Predator, Abyssal Dread-Beast, level 150, detected in immediate proximity. Host is completely incapacitated. Prompt: would you like to forcefully tether your leveling core to the target entity? Warning: tethering will place the host in absolute biological stasis. 100% of the target entity's earned EXP, dropped items, and stat multipliers will be automatically redirected to the host. Do you accept? My eyes flicked from the golden text to the gaping, fiery maw of the monster, now merely feet away. Parasitic Idle System. Ilara had called me a dead weight, a talentless sleeper. She thought I was the bait. She thought this dungeon was my grave. My bloody lips curled into a faint, exhausted smile. I didn't panic. I didn't flinch. Using the absolute last fraction of a percent of my willpower, I mentally selected yes. System ding. Confirmed. Connection established. The beast's jaws snapped shut, but they never reached my flesh. A blinding surge of golden energy erupted from my chest, instantly encasing my broken body in a flawless, impenetrable, diamond-hard crystal. The dread-beast roared in confusion, its teeth shattering against the stasis crystal like glass against a mountain. Inside the crystal, the pain vanished, the cold disappeared. My shattered bones were locked perfectly in place, preserved exactly as they were. I could see the monster raging outside, fruitlessly clawing at my indestructible shell, its own massive mana reserves now directly funding my survival. Every time it breathed, every time it killed a lesser monster in the dark, my core would reap the rewards. I didn't have to lift a finger. I didn't have to swing a sword. I just had to do what I did best. The golden system interface flashed one final time, a warm, comforting light in the eternal dark of the abyss. System ding. Stasis active. Initiating sleep mode. Sweet dreams host. I let out a slow, silent breath within my crystal tomb. Ilara and Valen were going to build an empire on the surface, entirely unaware that they had just given me the ultimate proxy. They had locked me in a room with the strongest monster on the continent and essentially handed me the controller. I closed my eyes. It was time for a nap. Sleeping in an indestructible diamond stasis crystal at the bottom of an abyssal dungeon is surprisingly peaceful. There is no hunger. There is no cold. There is only a profound, weightless silence, punctuated by the rhythmic digital heartbeat of the system. Suspended in the amber-like golden light of my own crystallized mana, my perception of time began to dilate. Minutes stretched into hours, days compressed into seconds. For the first few weeks, my newly acquired proxy, the level 150 Abyssal Dread-Beast, was furious. It spent entirely too much energy trying to crack my shell. It hurled me against the cavern walls, bathed me in corrosive purple flames, and crushed me under its massive paws. It was like watching a frustrated toddler trying to bite through a titanium vault. Eventually, instinct overrode its temper. It realized I was an immovable fixture in its territory, and it returned to what it did best: hunting. That was when the real dividends began to pay out. System Ding. Proxy Abyssal Dread-Beast has slain a cave troll, plus 5,000 XP, shared to host 100%. System Ding. Proxy has slain a Shadow Weaver, plus 12,000 XP, shared to host 100%. At first, the returns were modest. It was the equivalent of digital pennies dropping into a savings account. But the beauty of the Parasitic Idle System was that it functioned entirely on the principle of compound interest. Because I was absorbing the raw experience points, my core level was rising. And because my core was tethered to the beast, my passive stat multipliers began to secretly bleed over into the proxy. I was getting stronger while doing absolutely nothing, and my dog was becoming deadlier with every meal. By year 3, the abyssal floor had been entirely sterilized from native wildlife. The Dread-Beast had eaten everything from the lowest slimes to the cavern's native sub-bosses. It was starving, pacing the dark, waiting for fresh meat. Vanguard provided it. System Ding. Proxy has slain an A-rank Vanguard Eradicator, plus 450,000 XP. System Item Drop. 1 Vanguard Corporate Comlink Gold Tier intercepted, automatically deposited to host inventory. Through the haze of my slumber, I accessed the intercepted comlink. The audio was slightly corrupted by the beast's acidic saliva, but the voice filtering through the digital playback was unmistakable. Share prices are up 40% this quarter. Ilara's voice echoed in the dark of my mind. It was crisp, authoritative, and dripping with corporate arrogance. The Hunter Association has officially granted Vanguard Guild monopoly rights over Sector 7 gates. Send another team down to the C-rank abyssal floor. We need to harvest the beast's core for the upcoming gala. If they fail, fire their families. I didn't feel a spike of rage. I felt a profound sense of amusement. Ilara had ascended. She wasn't just a guildmaster anymore, she was a CEO. She was playing corporate politics, manipulating global stock markets, and sending men to their deaths as a tax write-off. She thought the abyssal floor was just another asset in her portfolio waiting to be liquidated. She didn't realize she was aggressively funding her own execution. System Ding. Proxy has slain the Vanguard Iron Blood Raid Party, 45 members, plus 18 million XP. System Ding. Proxy has reached level 300, forced evolution triggered, Abyssal Calamity Wolf. By year 6, Vanguard wasn't sending scout teams anymore. They were sending armies. The dungeon had become a meat grinder for Ilara's political rivals and underperforming guild branches. The system notifications became a blur of relentless, beautiful violence. I watched through the beast's sensory link as S-rank tanks, heavily armored in Vanguard-branded mythic gear, were casually bitten in half. I watched elite mages cast ultimate spells that simply bounced off my proxy's newly evolved magic immune scales. Every drop of their blood, every year of their grueling martial training, every million-dollar artifact they brought into the dark, it all converted to pure numerical data, flowing directly into my crystallized veins. Year 7. Proxy has slain the S-rank Celestial Guild, plus 900 million XP. Host has reached level 999. Mortal limit reached. Year 8. Proxy has consumed an invading national-level hunter, plus 5 billion XP. By Year 9, the Vanguard Guild stopped sending people altogether. They had finally realized that whatever was living at the bottom of the Sector 7 gate was no longer a monster, it was a localized apocalypse. They sealed it, layered it with billion-dollar Aegis defense arrays, and declared the dungeon a forbidden zone, content to simply build their corporate utopia on top of the sealed tomb. But the proxy was hungry, and the cavern walls were thin. Deprived of human flesh, the Calamity Wolf began digging into the dimensional fabric of the dungeon itself. It tore through the spatial boundaries, invading the hidden, deeper realms where the forgotten, latent gods of the abyss slept. System Ding. Proxy has engaged a lesser-dimensional deity. System Ding. Proxy has consumed the deity's divine core, plus 500 billion XP. The notifications were no longer blue, they were burning red, searing themselves into my consciousness. The sheer volume of energy violently forcing its way into my leveling core was beginning to fundamentally rewrite my human DNA. The shattered femurs that Valen had so generously provided 10 years ago were pulverized into dust, replaced instantly by bones woven from pure condensed mana. My blood turned a faint, glowing silver. The chains of human biological limitation, the cap on strength, agility, and cognitive processing that kept mortals in their place, was snapping one by one under the sheer, brutal weight of a decade's worth of passive hoarding. I could feel the mathematical fabric of the universe itself beginning to bend around the density of my existence. System Ding. Proxy has eradicated the Abyssal Pantheon, plus 850 trillion XP. System Warning. Total accumulated XP is approaching system display limits. I floated in the dark, my mind an iceberg of pure, crystalline calculation. 10 years of sleep. 10 years of letting my enemies build their glass castles directly on the fault line of my existence. Ilara wanted a monster to keep the dungeon busy. I had given her a god. System Ding. Total accumulated XP, 999 trillion. System Announcement. The host has bypassed the mortal limit. The golden light of my stasis crystal began to crack, a sound like a glacier tearing itself apart, echoing through the empty, corpse-littered abyss. My nap was over. The stasis crystal, once an impenetrable fortress of golden light, finally gave up the ghost. It didn't just break, it evaporated. The mana composing it absorbed back into my pores with the force of a collapsing star. I stood up. My feet didn't just touch the stone floor. They seemed to exert a gravitational pull on it, causing microscopic cracks to spiderweb outward from my heels. The silence of the abyss had changed. It was no longer the silence of a tomb, but the hushed, terrified silence of a courtroom waiting for a judge to pass a death sentence. I inhaled. The air was stale, tasted of ozone and ancient decay, but it felt intoxicating. My lungs, now reinforced with enough density to withstand the pressure of the deep mantle, expanded with a sound like a bellows. A few yards away, the Calamity Wolf, my proxy, trashed in the dark. It was a terrifying sight. 10 years ago, it had been a nightmare of muscle and hate. Now, it was a biological weapon of mass destruction, its fur glowing with the stolen divinity of the gods it had consumed. But, as I stepped forward, the creature didn't attack. It didn't growl. The 50-foot behemoth, a beast that had wiped out entire nations of hunters, did something that would have broken the minds of the Vanguard Guild's top researchers. It bowed. It pressed its massive, jagged snout into the dust, its body trembling as it whimpered, a high, pathetic sound that vibrated in the marrow of my bones. "You've been busy," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. It was deeper, colder, and possessed a resonance that made the cavern walls weep tears of mana-infused dust. I reached out and laid a hand on its brow. The beast didn't flinch. Through the tether, I felt a tidal wave of submission. It wasn't just fear. It was the instinctual recognition of a subordinate in the presence of an apex that had transcended the food chain. I looked at the state of my own body. My clothes, a decade old, were hanging off me in literal tatters, but the skin underneath was flawless, smooth, pale, and pulsing with a faint silver luminescence. Every micro-movement I made now felt like a symphony of perfect kinetic efficiency. I didn't need to learn how to fight. My muscle memory had been rewritten by the trillion XP I had siphoned. I knew the combat arts of 10,000 master hunters integrated into my subconscious as naturally as blinking. I looked up toward the ceiling. Miles above me, the Vanguard Guild's headquarters stood like a monument to their own hubris. System ding. Total accumulated XP, 999 trillion. System alert. Host has bypassed the mortal limit. New title unlocked. Transcendent Emperor. Transcendent, I whispered, testing the word. It felt small. I looked at the spatial barrier, the unbreakable wall that Vanguard had reinforced with the world's most expensive defense arrays to keep the horrors of the abyss away from their corporate paradise. It was a construct of high-density mana, designed to hold back the tides of hell. I raised a single finger and tapped it. I didn't use a spell. I didn't chant. I simply applied a fraction of a % of my raw physical pressure against the structural integrity of the field. Crack. The sound was sharp, like a lightning bolt striking a mirror. A web of violet fractures bloomed from my fingertip, spreading at the speed of sound. The defense array, a billion-dollar masterpiece of engineering, groaned in a frequency only mana-sensitive beings could hear. Then, it shattered. The barrier didn't just fail, it disintegrated, its constituent particles pulled into the gravitational wake of my movement. I walked forward, stepping out of the tomb. As I climbed the jagged, spiraling exit ramp, I didn't look back at the Calamity Wolf. I didn't have to. I felt it trailing behind me, its massive claws clicking softly on the stone, keeping pace with my leisurely stroll. The path to the surface was littered with the skeletal remains of my enemies, the S-rank hunters who had come to farm this floor, only to become the foundation of my godhood. Their armor was rusted to dust, their weapons brittle. I walked over them without glancing down. They were no longer targets, they were just debris. I reached the final gate, the massive, reinforced iron door that led to the Sector 7 staging ground. On the other side, I could hear the muffled, rhythmic thumping of industrial machinery and the distant hum of the city's life support systems. Ilara, Vanguard, the Gala. The system clock informed me it was the 10th anniversary of my sacrifice. They were likely halfway through a champagne toast to my memory. I placed my hand on the iron gate. It was 6 feet of enchanted, dragon-forged steel. I didn't bother unlocking it. I simply pushed. The metal didn't bend. It screamed, the hinges shearing away, and the gate tumbled forward into the staging area with the force of a siege engine. I stepped out into the light, my eyes narrowing as they adjusted to the artificial glare of the surface. I was back, and for the first time in 10 years, I was wide awake.
The staging area was a sterile, climate-controlled hub designed to process thousands of hunters and tons of monster materials daily. It was a hive of frantic activity, filled with white-robed guild staff, high-tech logistics drones, and the arrogant, well-fed security teams that patrolled the Vanguard-controlled sectors. When I stepped through the ruins of the Iron Gate, the entire facility didn't just stop, it died. The hume of the conveyor belts stuttered and stalled. A logistics drone, mid-flight, lost its signal and plummeted to the concrete with a metallic clatter. The security team, elite B-rank guards who usually walked with the swagger of untouchable kings, froze. They stared at me, a man dressed in rags that belonged in a museum of ancient history, accompanied by a calamity wolf that dwarfed the ceiling-mounted surveillance cameras. I didn't acknowledge them. I didn't even look at their trembling weapons. I walked toward the central information terminal, a massive, shimmering display panel showing the real-time stock prices of Vanguard Industries and the Global Hunter Association Index. I walked right up to the terminal, the air around me warping with the sheer density of my mana. A guard stepped forward, his hand hovering over his holster, his face a mask of confusion and mounting dread. "Stop," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Unauthorized entry. Identify your—" I didn't turn my head. I simply let out a sliver of my aura. The guard didn't fly backward. He just slumped to his knees, his eyes rolling back, as the sheer psychological weight of my existence bypassed his conscious mind and triggered his amygdala's prey response. He began to weep uncontrollably and silently as he collapsed into a fetal position. I tapped the glass of the terminal. My Transcendent-Rank brain didn't need a keyboard. I viewed the digital architecture of the Vanguard network as series of glowing, interconnected ley lines. I saw the encrypted firewalls, the hidden subroutines, and the secret shadow ledgers where Ilara hid the illicit funds she'd stolen from my startup 10 years ago. It was amateurish. It was a digital fortress built of paper. I reached out, my fingers dancing in the air above the screen, though I wasn't touching the hardware. Lines of code cascaded down the terminal, flickering and changing color as I rewrote their reality. System ding. Accessing Vanguard Industries' global mainframe. Security breach detected. Firewalls bypassed. Command executed. Shadow assets liquidated. Command executed. Executive account access granted. I watched the stock prices move. Vanguard was currently riding the hype of their anniversary gala, their market valuation reaching an all-time high. With a flick of my wrist, I initiated a series of cascading sell orders. I didn't flood the market, that would be noisy. I orchestrated a glitch, a series of automated, high-speed trades that made it look like the guild's core assets were suddenly, inexplicably tied to a bankrupt shell company in the abyss. I watched the red numbers begin to bleed across the screen.
I diverted the Vanguard's liquid reserves, billions of credits, into a holding account registered under the name The Sleeper. Then I went deeper. I accessed the personal legal documents of every board member. I found the blackmail files they kept on politicians, the hidden records of their illegal human experimentation labs, and the private correspondence where Alara had bragged about the successful elimination of Kael. I didn't send them to the police. The police were on Vanguard's payroll. Instead, I uploaded the entire cache to a decentralized, unblockable public ledger, a black box file that would auto-replicate across every server on the planet if anyone tried to delete it. The terminal flickered one last time, a message appearing in bold crimson text. Vanguard Corp. Account access restricted. Ownership transferred. I turned away from the terminal. The staging area was a scene of total, paralyzed chaos. People were staring at their personal devices as the alerts started to ping, their faces shifting from confusion to horror as they watched their guild's wealth evaporate in real time. "Who are you?" someone shouted from the back of the room. It was a mid-level manager, his face white as a sheet, holding a tablet that was likely showing his own bank account hitting 0. I stopped at the edge of the staging area, the Calamity Wolf looming behind me like a mountain of shadow. I looked back, my eyes glowing with a faint silver light that made everyone in the room look away. "I'm the audit," I said. I walked out into the city streets of Sector 7. The sky was filled with holographic advertisements for the anniversary gala. Ilara's face, 20 feet tall, smiling down at a city that was about to find out exactly what their idol had done to me. I checked my system interface. Status: current net worth, 400 billion credits. Status: Vanguard Guild valuation, declining. Status: psychological warfare, initiated. I hailed a sleek, automated transit pod. It didn't ask for identification. It just registered my mana signature, turned a deep, subservient purple, and unlocked its doors for me. The stage was set. The invitation to the gala had been sent to me 10 years ago, an automated system message for the VIPs who were supposed to be honored at the ceremony. They hadn't bothered to remove my name from the list. It was time to collect my invitation.
The grand ballroom of the Vanguard Tower was a testament to the kind of excess that only 10 years of unchecked monopoly can buy. The ceiling was a dome of artificial night sky, projecting constellations that didn't exist, while the floor was a seamless expanse of polished black marble. 1,000 guests, corporate elites, influential mages, and the sycophantic media milled about with champagne in hand, their laughter a dull, rhythmic roar of orchestrated vanity. At the far end of the room stood the podium, a raised dais crafted from gold-plated iron where Ilara stood.
She was breathtakingly beautiful, draped in a gown that looked as if it were woven from liquid moonlight. 10 years ago today, she said, her voice amplified by localized sound magic to reach every corner of the vast space. We faced the greatest threat the Abyss had ever produced. We suffered losses. She paused, bowing her head in a perfectly rehearsed display of grief. We lost pioneers. We lost friends. We lost Kael. The room went silent. She played the part of the grieving widow so perfectly that I almost applauded. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the single solitary tear that rolled down her cheek. But from that sacrifice, we built this city. We built this peace. Vanguard is not just a guild, it is the cornerstone of humanity's survival. The audience erupted into polite, thunderous applause. Ilara flashed a radiant, tragic smile, reaching for the champagne flute being offered by her lead butler. Then, the heavy oak doors at the entrance didn't just swing open, they atomized. The wood grain didn't splinter, it dissolved into fine gray dust, drifting into the room on a sudden icy draft of subterranean air. The music cut out as if someone had sliced the conductor's throat. 1,000 heads turned toward the doorway. I stepped into the ballroom. I hadn't bothered to change. I was still wearing the same tattered, blood-caked clothes from a decade ago. My hair was long, unkempt, and filled with the dust of the abyss. Behind me, the Calamity Wolf, its presence so vast it felt like a mountain was being shoved into the room, paced into the ballroom. Its claws didn't scratch the marble, they sank into it as if the stone were soft butter, leaving deep, jagged craters with every step. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of a species that had just realized it was no longer at the top of the food chain. Ilara's glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the marble with the sound like a gunshot, shattering into a dozen pieces. Her face didn't just pale, it turned the color of parchment, her jaw slackening until she looked like a grotesque doll. Kael? The name didn't sound like a question. It sounded like a death rattle. "The microphone is still on, Ilara," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a strange, heavy timbre that caused the chandeliers to chime in sympathy. "You were talking about sacrifice. I thought I'd come by and give you a more accurate account." Valen, the S-Rank tank, stepped forward. His armor, custom-fitted with gold filigree and glowing mana runes, looked ridiculous compared to the aura I was projecting. He drew his blade, a long, shimmering frost steel claymore, but his hand was shaking so violently the steel rattled against his pauldrons. "Imposter!" he roared, though the conviction wasn't in his eyes. "Kill him! That's an illusion." "Save your breath, Valen," I said, walking down the center aisle. I didn't move fast. I didn't need to. Every step I took caused the air to ripple, creating a localized pressure field that forced the elite guards flanking the stage to their knees. Their knees hit the marble with audible, bone-snapping thuds. They weren't fighting me. They were being held down by the weight of my presence. "You've been enjoying the view from the top for 10 years, Ilara," I continued, stopping at the foot of the podium. I looked up at Ilara, who was gripping the edge of the gold-plated desk so hard her knuckles were white. But you forgot one thing about building a skyscraper, Ilara. You can put as much gold on the facade as you want. It doesn't change the fact that the foundation is made of broken bone. I looked around the room. The cameras were fixed on me. Every live stream in the country was broadcasting my face, my rags, and the massive snarling beast at my back to millions of viewers. I think it's time we audited the books.
The room was suffocating. Every breath taken by the guests felt like it had to be earned. Valen, the Vanguard's pride and joy, remained on his knees, his claymore forgotten on the floor. His eyes were wide, darting between me and the Calamity Wolf, which was currently sniffing the opulent floral arrangements with a rhythmic, guttural huff that sounded like grinding boulders. "Illusion?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence. I tilted my head toward Valen. "Is that what you're telling them to maintain your sanity? That a decade of training, a fortune in stolen capital, and your own cowardice have all been undone by a trick of the light?" You were bait," Valen whispered, his voice trembling. "We left you for the beast. We saw you shredded. We saw the portal close." "You saw what your arrogance allowed you to see."
Ilara finally found her voice. She pulled a miniature mana cannon from beneath the podium, her knuckles bleeding where she had gripped the edge of the desk. "Security! Neutralize him! I don't care about the cameras! Kill him!" The guards didn't move. They couldn't. They were trapped in the crushing gravitational pressure of my mana. "There is no need for violence, Ilara," I said, my tone eerily calm. "Violence is for people who lack better arguments. You've spent 10 years telling the world that you were the hero of the abyssal floor, that you fought a tactical retreat, that I died to ensure humanity's survival." I raised my right hand, and the system interface that only I had been able to see for a decade suddenly expanded, projecting itself into the air in a massive, shimmering 3D hologram. Let's revisit the narrative. The hologram didn't show a heroic battle. It showed the high-definition, unedited memory of that night. The audio played back with terrifying clarity, Ilara's voice commanding Valen to break my legs, the sound of my bones snapping like dry kindling, the thud of my body hitting the cavern floor. The smug, calculated way Ilara looked at her watch while leaving me to be torn apart. The room erupted in a collective gasp that sounded like a vacuum being opened.
"No," Ilara shrieked, firing the mana cannon directly at me. The bolt of concentrated energy tore through the air, but it never touched my skin. 3 feet from my chest, the energy simply stopped, suspended in midair by a static field I hadn't even consciously summoned. It sat there, a glowing ball of destructive force, before I casually pushed it aside with a flick of my finger. It struck a gold-plated statue behind me, vaporizing the metal instantly. I didn't stop the recording. "Look closely," I said, gesturing to the hologram where Ilara was seen calculating the exact financial gain of my death. "This is the cornerstone of humanity's survival." She didn't trade my life for a victory. She traded it for a quarterly dividend. I walked to the podium. Ilara backed away, stumbling over her own train until she hit the wall behind the dais. She looked around for support,
But the investors, the media, and the other guild members were all staring at her with varying degrees of shock, horror, and opportunism. The hero was naked, and the world was watching. I walked to the podium. I whispered, leaning over the podium so the microphone picked up my every word. You wanted to celebrate 10 years of Vanguard. I figured I'd give you the truth as my gift. I swiped the air, and a second, more damning log appeared, a map of all the illegal experimentation labs Ilara had been running, complete with the names of the missing hunters who had been accidentally lost in dungeons, just like the one she'd left me in. The silence was broken by the frantic ding-ding-ding of 1,000 mobile devices simultaneously receiving the uploaded files from the public ledger I'd compromised earlier. Every person in the room held the evidence of her depravity in the palm of their hand. The gala is over, Ilara, I said, stepping back. The ballroom had devolved into a microcosm of total societal collapse. The elite guests, who minutes ago were sipping vintage champagne and fawning over Ilara, were now huddled in corners, frantically scrolling through their devices. The evidence of Vanguard's systemic butchery was being shared across every major news network. The foundation of their world wasn't just cracking, it was liquefying. Ilara, her back pressed against the wall, looked at the crowd. Her eyes were wide, frantic, searching for a lifeline. She locked eyes with the guild vice master, who was still on his knees. He didn't look at her. He looked at the floor, his face devoid of any loyalty. "Kill him," Ilara whispered, the command lacking all its former authority. "Valen, kill him. If he dies, the system logs are just glitches. It's all a forgery." Valen, sensing the shift in the wind, slowly stood up. He didn't draw his weapon. He stepped backwards, away from Ilara. "I'm not dying for you, Ilara," Valen said, his voice cold. "I'm not dying for a sinking ship." The betrayal was the final nail. Ilara shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated primal frustration, and frantically hit the emergency override on her wrist-mounted mana controller. "Aegis array, full power, purge the ballroom, purge everything." The floor beneath the gold-plated podium hummed with a violent violet energy. The Vanguard Tower was designed as a fortress. Hidden within the walls were rows of high-output plasma emitters, the same technology that kept the Sector 7 gates secure. The air began to smell of ozone and burning hair. A hum, a piercing whine, vibrated through the floorboards. "You think you can win?" Ilara laughed, a hysterical, jagged sound. "If I'm going down, I'm taking the whole sector with me. If you're so obsessed with the truth, Kael, let's see how you handle a direct hit from a city defense grid." The plasma emitters ignited. Beams of raw, concentrated thermal energy erupted from the walls, converging on me. The heat was immense, enough to melt steel in milliseconds. The guests screamed, diving behind marble pillars, their finery singe as the air in the ballroom superheated. I didn't move. I didn't raise a shield. I simply watched the plasma bathe the room. When the light faded, the ballroom was a disaster zone. The gold-plated podium was slag. The marble floor was a cratered, charred ruin. I was still standing in the center, untouched, not a single thread of my tattered clothes scorched. "Is that it?" I asked, my voice echoing in the scorched space. $1 billion of defense grid, and you can't even singe my sleeves? Ilara was hyperventilating, staring at the empty space where she'd intended me to be vaporized. She looked up, and for the first time, she saw the true scale of what she'd awakened.
I snapped my fingers. The sound was small, but the result was cataclysmic. The ceiling of the ballroom didn't just break, it vanished, ripped away by a force that defied physics. The night sky above Sector 7 was blotted out by a massive, reptilian shadow. The Calamity Wolf descended. It was no longer lurking in the hallways. It had physically forced its way into the tower, its colossal serrated tail wrapping around the structural support beams of the skyscraper. The building groaned, a high-pitched, terrifying sound of metal fatigue as the beast's grip caused the entire structure to tilt 5 degrees to the west. Inside the ballroom, the guests felt the sudden lurch. Panic, real and desperate, took hold. They scrambled for the exits, but the Calamity Wolf's massive head blocked the doorway, its crimson eyes glowing like twin furnaces. "I told you, Ilara," I said, walking toward her through the smoke. "I took a nap. I let you play your little games. I let you build your little kingdom." I gestured to the beast, which let out a low, vibrating growl that rattled the remaining glass in the windows. "But I think it's time you met my pet. He's been very hungry for 10 years. The silence that followed the Calamity Wolf's arrival was the silence of absolute, final defeat. The Vanguard Tower groaned again, the steel skeleton shrieking as it fought against the colossal weight of the beast coiled around its exterior. Ilara sank to the floor, her legs finally giving out. She was no longer the CEO of a global superpower. She was just a small, broken person shivering in the shadow of a god. She looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot, her perfectly styled hair matted with sweat and soot. "Kael, please," she whispered, the words coming out as a choked, pathetic sob. We can share it. I can make you the chairman. I can give you everything back. Just make it stop." I looked down at her. I didn't feel the burning hatred I had nursed in the dark of the abyss for 10 years. That would have been a waste of energy. I felt nothing. The same cold, clinical detachment I'd felt when I watched the Vanguard servers collapse. She wasn't an enemy anymore. She was a variable that had been solved. I stepped forward, my shadow stretching over her like a shroud. I reached out and tapped the center of her chest, right over her monocore. With a soft, melodic tink, the barrier holding her cultivation energy together shattered. There was no explosion, no flash of light, just the sudden, permanent evaporation of the power she had used to build her life on my back. She slumped forward, clutching her chest, her gasps for air turning into ragged wheezes. She was immortal again. No longer the high-tier mage, just a woman who had run out of time. "You had 10 years to build a legacy, Ilara," I said, my voice quiet, cutting through the terrified murmurs of the remaining guests. "You chose to build a lie. Now you get to live the reality you created for me." I gestured to the Calamity Wolf.
The beast nudged the remains of the ballroom wall aside, revealing the gaping violet-hued tunnel it had torn through the dimensional fabric. A direct, one-way path back to the bottom of the abyssal floor. "I'm not killing you," I continued. "That would be a mercy you didn't earn. You're going to go back to the dark. No magic, no credits, no Vanguard. Just the same cold, empty silence you left me in a decade ago. Let's see how long you last as the bait."
The beast reached in, its massive jaws gently but firmly gripping the Vanguard leadership, Ilara, the sniveling vice master, and the remnants of their inner circle. It didn't tear them apart, it carried them like trash. With a powerful shove, the Calamity Wolf retreated into the dimensional rift, dragging the architects of my misery into the abyss. The tunnel flickered and slammed shut, leaving the ballroom in a state of stunned, hollow stillness. I turned around. The gala was over. The Vanguard Guild was a corpse, and the world was already starting to panic as the news of their crimes flooded every screen on the planet. I felt a familiar, heavy fatigue pressing against my eyelids. The sheer volume of mana I had released today, combined with the reality warping I'd performed on the Vanguard network, had left me slightly drained. "System," I murmured. "System ding. All primary objectives achieved. Vanguard Guild neutralized. Financial and social assets absorbed. System ding. Shall I initiate Shadow Emperor Protocol?" I looked out at the city, a sprawling, neon-lit labyrinth of greed and ambition, now wide open for the taking. I didn't care about the politics. I didn't care about the accolades. I wanted a quiet room, a comfortable chair, and the ability to close my eyes without worrying about the next raid party. "Initiate it," I said, turning my back on the ruin of the ballroom. "But set the notifications to silent. I'm done with the noise." I walked toward the broken exit, the cold night air rushing in to meet me. The world was mine, and I had a long, long nap ahead of me.